Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this conversation about our aspirations for the values of justice. This is our final panel and session of the Roundtable on the Future of Justice Policy. Not only the final panel and session of this Roundtable, but the final session of our series of 5 Roundtable convenings over the past 3 years. Over that past 3 years at each Roundtable, we've always concluded our convenings with a session on aspirations, and this event is no different. This is a crucial moment for the Roundtable in which we uplift work that's happening in the field of transformative justice, and it fits into this crucial moment in our history when we really must uplift the people and the efforts that they're leading if we want to have any hope of foundationally reimagining justice in our country. We've asked some of the many luminaries in transformative justice to join us for this closing panel discussion and get us started, to share with us some promising practices and solutions that exist that radically change the values and the principles of justice. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you all today Eric Cummerbach, the Deputy Director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice in New York City, and the Director of the Office of Neighborhood Safety. Vivian Nixon, who's the Executive Director of College and Community Fellowship, and Danielle Thread, who's the Executive Director of Common Justice. They've all been part of our Square One and Roundtable journey for this entire time, and it's just really wonderful to have a chance to talk with you all for a few minutes, and then we'll be opening up to all of our Roundtable participants for this discussion about the aspirations of justice. So we just, for those of us who joined us for our earlier session today, we were able to talk and hear about a lot of the work that's been happening in New York and the excitement, the potential, the challenges, the problems from a number of New Yorkers who've been a part of that experience. Danielle and Eric and Vivian were all part of that conversation, and they've also prepared writings for us to tee up this conversation today. You've written about individuals and their efforts that have already gained ground in the justice system, in changing the justice system, and in the ways that communities create and manage safety. I'd love to hear from you. Tell us a little more about what were the driving forces behind the creation of those organizations or efforts. Was it community leaders? Was it people who have experienced the criminal justice system? Who was it that was the driving force behind those? And anyone can jump in, or I will start calling on folks. How do these things get started?
I don't mind starting. I had trouble picking out an organization to highlight, and so I really highlighted a network of organizations that I belong to that extends beyond New York City. And the reason I did that is because they're all motivated by the same thing, and that is their incarceration experience. Every organization that's a part of the national network that I wrote about, the formerly incarcerated and convicted people's family movement, is motivated by a direct experience with the criminal legal system and has a passion to change it from the perspective of understanding its roots being cemented in structural racism. And there are 2 New York organizations that are part of that national steering committee. That's why I chose it.
Thanks, Vivian. Danielle, tell us a little bit about Common Justice and the motivating work there, or the motivations and starting points of some of the other organizations that you write about in your paper.
Sure. So I would be remiss if I didn't start by lifting up Amanda Alexander, the co-author on the paper that we circulated to all, who is just a beloved friend and colleague and teacher of mine in many ways. And I'm thinking about the conversation we had this morning, and a trope that I hear a lot in the public conversation now, that's we know what safety looks like. It's what exists in rich white neighborhoods or rich white suburban neighborhoods, or however it gets framed. And I think there are 2 problems with that kind of include the answer to this. I think the first is it misses the way in which, even in those neighborhoods, if Black and brown people, particularly from outside those neighborhoods, dare cross the perimeter, the level of violence there is even greater. The price of entry is death. So they are they have moats around them. They have snipers at the top of the towers, right? And we should understand them that way. They are not places free of violence for everyone. And so even in those neighborhoods, there is a constant permanent presence of racialized violence. even if most of that is obtained by having made so clear the grave consequences of crossing that perimeter that very few people do. And so I don't want to mythologize them as a place that are somehow outside of a structure of racialized policing. And then the other thing is we talk about, I think the biggest mistake people of color make about white people is people of color overestimate how good we are to each other. I do aspire for most people to have the relationship to the state that most white people have. I think the state in general acts as though it has an obligation to us, including one to meet our most basic needs. It acts as though it has an obligation to create conduits for our input, including through things like voting. And it acts as though its use of force against us should be constrained in some way, including by some entitlement we have to life and liberty, right? And that's a set of things I would wish for everybody. But that's different than the way white people relate to one another. And I think about the core modes of white supremacy, in my view, are controlling, punishing, exiling, and exterminating. And I didn't come to that list through like a 500-year study of white people in the United States and in colonial history. I came through it through an observation of patterns in my own white family and what we do to whom people regard as like the least among us. And so I say that because the examples that Amanda and I lift up are almost exclusively examples that are led by Black and brown people in communities of color, where people have been and are solving their problems, mending pain, restoring peace, healing through loss and harm, and have been for centuries. And I think all of the evidence about how cycles of violence work can explain why there are high levels of violence in neighborhoods like East New York or Brownsville and Brooklyn. None of that literature can actually explain why there isn't more. It cannot explain, like given centuries and centuries of both structural, interpersonal violence and torture, why anyone does anything other than commit harm. Like why the vast majority of people in Black and brown neighborhoods act in ways that are loving and life-affirming and often even joyful. Like it is not accounted for in the way we think about safety, not sufficiently, right? And so one of the things we know is that the strategies that exist have to be extraordinarily powerful, that they are the explanation for the gap between what the literature would otherwise predict and the fact of what is a comparably low level of violence given the set of historical and current conditions. And so we look to those interventions not as like clever, promising, grassroots, something or other, right? Like that we look at those interventions as ones that have demonstrated an efficacy in the face of like an ungodly amount of opposing and intervening factors, and therefore recognize that in them a really extraordinary strength, particularly if they were given the opportunity to act in the absence of those intrusions. And so in the argument Amanda and I make, it's not just like, can we be safe and defund the police? We ask the question instead, can we be safe without defunding the police? And if we understand policing as we know it as something that intrudes on the efficacy of community-based solutions that are in the ongoing business of producing safety, then the answer is that defunding the police is a prerequisite for the level of safety to which we'd aspire.
Thank you, Danielle. That's just so important, the context that you've given there and the way, connecting the motivations and the driving forces with the differences across communities and across time, really. Eric, tell us a little bit about the work you've written about. How did that happen, and how has that been able to continue? Are there things that we can learn from the experience that you were describing in your paper, or others that you know of in your work?
Yeah, definitely. So first and foremost, I want to recognize that there's great activists and advocates in New York City that have propelled me to this space, but have also lifted up a national movement through their just sense of being in New York City. So a lot of the approaches and models and methods that I can talk through today are really about their brilliance. And even though they may be public health based and evidence-based approaches, a lot of these things happened organically, and they were doing without the sort of nomenclature or just framing from a more academic space and sense. So a lot of the groups, two of the groups that I chose to write about were Man Up Incorporated in East New York and Brownsville Think Tank Matters. And these groups are really special to me, both personally and professionally. So Man Up is an organization that formed together in East New York, Brooklyn, over a shooting death of a young boy in the area. And really just concerned individuals from the community that came together and said, we're not going to tolerate reckless and senseless killings, especially of our young people in our community. They formed an organization called Man Up, which is led by A.T. Mitchell, who's like an East New York legend, hero for all of the right reasons. And he plays almost a role as like an uncle to me, really good brother. And, you know, really his vision, his thoughts, ideas around how to transform neighborhood spaces, how to build and empower community to be at the forefront of co-producing public safety, how to foster relationships with government, strategically resource different levels or spaces for intervention and engagement, is what he's doing on the ground. So it's really great work. And I felt, you know, I wanted to highlight him because we share a very, just a common false narrative that happens across our community. So I'm from Bed-Stuy, he's East New York. And oftentimes what we would receive here from media, other spaces, other agencies, really trying to diminish Black men, men of color, by labeling them gang members and or former gang members. And, you know, me and AT would have these conversations on a regular basis. And what he wanted to do was really start a campaign. And the campaign was, I am a man. And first and foremost, I am a man. And my past discrepancies, you know, how we define crews and gangs in New York, I already think are way out of line in general. I think, you know, you live in dense areas and, you know, people are your family and that's your communal network. But in New York, if you're in these East New York or Bed-Stuy, you're a part of a gang, according to a lot of agencies' framing. So the I am a man piece was really about allowing Black men to control their own narrative, that only I can tell you who I am. And no one else can put a label on me to diminish me or to remove me from a position of power, and or to really create a space where there's no empathy or no sense of belonging, contributing, or understanding. And those things happen every day when we turn on TV, when we read newspapers, or listen to the ways that people frame those who have been harmed and or have caused harm. So I really wanted to focus on A.T. Mitchell and Ronald Robertson, Brother Powerful from Brownsville Think Tank Matters. Both of these men are formerly incarcerated individuals that have come back to their community. They operate within great organizations on the ground at a very local grassroots level. And, you know, for me, I've worked with them probably since 2010, 11, when these groups, these organizations probably had fiscal year operating budgets of maybe $250,000 to now lifting them to capacity upwards of over $10 million budgets to really go back in community and do a lot of what we're at the table talking about. They're actually doing it. So just brilliant people that I'm grateful to be, you know, surrounded by, protected by, and served with
Eric, thank you for that. It's, you know, it's just so powerful, the story you just shared and the information that's in your paper about, you know, the importance of centering humanity by claiming the space of I am a man, and that's a definition that I create for myself and that can't be taken away. That's just, it's so powerful and important. So talk to me for a minute. I mean, I just would love to hear from any of you really concretely, you know, what are the things that, you know, for any of the leaders, for any of the participants, for any of the people who are part of and who are driving the work that you're describing and the things that are happening around the country, in New York, otherwise as well, you know, if what would be something that would contribute to, that would support any one of those leaders that you just described, that each of you just described, being able to do more, being able to do something that to get around, Deanna mentioned earlier, to get around the barriers that are put in our way and that we have to strategically figure out how to get around. What does that look like? What's needed? What's missing? What could contribute to that, to that leadership and to the continued growth and development of those organizations?
You know, a lot of times it's the basic premise of how we go about doing this work. So in the work to reduce mass incarceration, to dismantle mass incarceration, to reform, reimagine, reinvent, dismantle, abolish the system, we have created many different types of solutions, but the ones that are based in communities and in trying to help repair harms and move people forward, there was traditionally for years, I saw kind of the expectation that people were there to be helped and served and not to develop power in order to figure out how to be the drivers of the solutions in their own communities, the way Eric describes. And that's exactly what I saw when I joined College and Community Fellowship. It was an organization that did a lot of good for all of the women who were in it. We were getting our college degrees. We were getting support in doing so. We had better opportunities for our individual futures because of it. But until I got connected to Just Leadership USA, and then got connected to the formerly incarcerated and convicted people's movement, and found that there were all these other directly impacted people who had a bigger vision, who had a vision of organizing and changing systems and policies in their local areas, I did not make that connection. And once I did, we embedded advocacy and organizing training into the organization, because it's not being done everywhere. It's seen as two different things, that either you're serving people's needs or you're advocating and organizing. Both can be done at the same time, and they're done most effectively at the same time.
Yeah, Danielle, I see you nodding your head. You want to jump in there?
It just resonates so much. And I feel like one of the things that I think is available to us now is I feel like for so long, our movement has been like 90% destroyers and 10% builders. And that we have an opportunity to invert that ratio. And I think, you know, Doctors Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis for decades have been teaching us that like abolition is mostly the work of creation, not of destruction. I have a 2-year-old now, so I have become somebody who needs to understand different kinds of trucks and things at construction sites. This is not a realm of knowledge that was previously important to me. And what I've observed now is that at any construction site, almost all of them have a bulldozer. It's true. And they all tend to only have one. And then they have just like a ton of other things, right? They have this crane truck and this other crane truck and this thing that brings stuff in and this thing that loads stuff up. And then there's electricians, there's plumbers, there's all of this. So like it is absolutely the case. There are things that we have to tear down. It's absolutely the case. It will take force and power to do that, that work is important. But that work of construction, I think, has been in so many ways undervalued. And I think about the end of mass incarceration in so many ways about the work of displacing it. And that means both building the things we want and, to Vivian's point, building the collective power to secure those things as our society's central response to harm and to behavior that has previously been criminalized that may or may not include harm. And so I think largely when we see people build that power, the main things people do with it is they command resources, they command narrative power, meaning they like take up public space in a different way that shapes the discourse. And they create like barriers to the intrusion of other actors into the work that they are doing, that they can defend the spaces that they are protecting, that they are generating, that they are creating from the intrusion of others, including law enforcement in its various forms. And so entirely agree with Vivian that that organized power is the biggest difference between where we are and where we need to be.
Eric, I'm going to ask you to weigh in too, and also go ahead and invite some of our participants to start raising your hands if you are interested in asking questions or weighing in, because we want to make sure we have plenty of time for a group discussion as well. But Eric, I'll give the floor to you to respond to the thoughts of Danielle and Vivian and this question about what's still missing and where are we headed and what's needed.
Yeah, I think opening spaces and platforms for small community-based organizations to really redesign, gather research, secure resources, and do actual implementation work, not only in their communities, but in the agencies, in city government, local governments, what have you, that have touched and so much impact on a very already vulnerable population. And I think when we talk about reimagining systems or just system change as a whole, oftentimes what's missing are the key people that are the end users of a lot of how these systems show up, how they do harm, whether intentional or unintentional, and how that harm can be lessened, if not taken away completely. And I think the more spaces we open in all of these structures that are inclusive in a true capacity to build with the small grassroots organizations and specifically the ones that I'm naming, then we see results that are incredible. So there was a lot of conversation earlier today around youth in secure detention facilities or youth in ACS close to home facilities and the closure of Rikers and so forth. Part of that story, a lot of the organizations that we resource, equip, and fund are actually in those spaces as well. And they're not in those spaces because we believe any young person should be detained in a secured facility and or be at a close to home facility. They're in those spaces because they're sharing their story and they're lifting up those young people as shepherds and mentors and being part of the process to heal those young people in those spaces without having to become bureaucrats or government actors. A lot of these young people are coming back to the community, seeking these individuals out to continue those relationships and to continue that network. So that network actually captures a lot of people who have risk factors in their lives, allows them to fail just like any of us have failed, captures them and lifts them right back up. And that's what I think those platforms and spaces being open to systems change.
Eric, thank you so much. That just really resonates. And I'm going to be handing over the facilitation of our group discussion to Jeremy Travis, but we'll start off with Monica Bell. I'm hearing a lot of the themes and a lot of the questions that you were talking about in the paper that you wrote for the earlier session of the roundtable about the relationships between different types of organizations and communities. And so, Monica, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, sure. So I just mostly want to thank all three of you for all of your amazing work and also the papers that you wrote. And, we started the roundtable with this, I think kind of challenging conversation about, it's like, what are we even talking about starting with values? Like, why would you do that? We don't have shared values. I think if anything, we learn from what's going on in the world of the criminal legal system, that there are a lot of conflicting values. And so one of the, we kind of started with this values conversation, talked, I think, a lot about politics, you can't have a conversation about values without really just thinking about the political space. And the other thing we were talking a lot about was like really, learning from the work that is actually happening on the ground. And that's how you would get a sense of like what the right values are. And so I guess one of the things that stood out to me just in this conversation, and also, reading the papers, is that the values that were implicitly discussed in all of the work, or explicitly discussed, are, I think, very far away from what a lot of people who sit in spaces like this, and also people who kind of think they're, big time policy people in the criminal legal space, are up to. So things like, like Eric, you were talking about just now, people being able to control their own narrative and defining themselves. And you talk in the piece about, Black men who have transformed and liberated themselves, and like that personal transformation process. That seems like so deeply important, but is like not at all, like there's not a deep story of like really centering personal transformation that builds from inside. That's not imposed, is not attempted to be imposed by some like punitive force. That's not deeply a part of even the like pretty radical transformative conversations we have. So I wanted to think more about that. Danielle, you in the piece, and Amanda Alexander talk a lot about what the new world looks like, exactly where you're picking up in the conversation, as well as, collective power and the way you break it down in the piece with economic narrative and political power. Then, of course, the way Vivian talks about like self-determination, collective power, and accountability. All of these values are what emerge from the work you're actually doing, but are deeply, I think I'm still haunted by this thing I participated in earlier this morning with these like federal policy people, where it was like, the police haters, blah, blah, blah. And I was just like, what are you even talking about? Like, it's really hard to be there, because their work just seems, and the way of thinking seems really far away from the work you're doing, yet they're in these federal policy spaces that are quite divorced from communities. So I guess what I'm thinking about in this conversation about values and aspirations is how we get over that political hump, or even if maybe we don't have to think about that. Like maybe the thing is just to like focus on work that is actually happening. But if we want to take control of this moment and build power that scales, how are you all thinking about those sorts of questions?
So I think the baton has been passed to me, and I see Aneka had raised her blue hand before. Before we switch gears and mindsets, I'd like to ask her to join the conversation, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I had well, thank you. I think we lost Vivian for a moment, but thanks to Vivian, Danielle, and Eric for your conversation. I had a follow-up question, mainly for you, Eric and Danielle, based off of the comments that you raised. I think it was Deanna earlier, who rightfully so said that the criminal justice system is not the only system that causes harm, right? That's not the only system we should be focusing on. And Danielle, you talked about abolition in terms of creating and what we're building. And Eric, you talked about the power of our young people and how organizations are going into these institutions to support the healing of our young people. And I'm wondering, is any work being done with the New York school system to teach our young kids about organizing and advocacy and thinking about creating our next generation of leaders and hopefully building some buffer to some of the harms that we see, and also creating communities of healing instead of schools that are harming our kids.
Yeah, I would say, work is being done, but not at the scale that it should and could be. And that you have some schools that, use their, so to speak, discretionary funding to invest in these types of opportunities. And then you have others where it's a foreign concept and that process doesn't occur. We're blessed to have a lot of great organizations across the city that also do a lot of youth empowerment, youth building types of activities, workshops, and just have, large footprints in certain schools. But, I don't think, and this probably gets to your point, there's not a concentrated effort around curriculum building from our Department of Education that specifically focuses on that type of, really deep healing, understanding, truth-telling, youth empowerment, community engagement. So I haven't seen that in our schools, but there are individuals and organizations who do that work. I'm also of the mindset that I'm not trusting. I have a 14-year-old son, Isan, who's texting me as I'm speaking, but I'm not for the schools necessarily being the ones that deliver that message and or carry that torch for me. I don't trust that. I don't trust the institution, and it's almost to the part of getting back to what I was raising earlier, that these systems continue to cause harm. I'm not going to entrust that level of spiritual building within that institution for my son. So, I just wanted to also share that. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Danielle, would you like to respond also to Ineka's question?
Sure, and I'm happy to sort of loop it back to the question Monica offered into the space too, which is, I agree with Eric. I think of the New York City school system as a likely target of organizing, and most of us don't train the people who will take us down or displace us. And so, but I think a lot about a mentor and friend of mine, Lorenzo Jones, talks about a mentor and friend of his who taught him, we don't win because we're right, we win because we're strong. And I think we make a lot of arguments about we evidence-based this and even moral arguments, and that the thing that will carry the day is going to be organized power. And I think when I think about your question, Monica, I actually feel very optimistic about building a substantial enough national consensus around the failings of mass incarceration to be able to bring it to its knees. And that's in part because I think of the Forward.us study that found 1 in 2 people in America have a loved one who has been incarcerated. And so mass incarceration's very expansion has in it, I believe, the seeds of its demise, because there are so many people who have direct experience and information about its failings. And the one thing that typically overcomes a steady onslaught of propaganda is our own lived experience. And so the range of people, including plenty of white people, not a lot of rich people, but plenty of white people, have an understanding of the ways in which that system fails. And I think there is a huge opportunity in that. We see in our work a really profound consensus among crime survivors that incarceration is not the thing that will protect them or heal them. And it is increasingly clear that the survivors' voices who have been held central are a really non-representative set of outliers, which means that the problem we're facing in that case is not a hearts and minds problem, but a narrative one. It means we have to make the vast majority of people who know it fails visible to one another so that they can experience themselves as a majority and do what majorities then do, which is to win. And so I think for those reasons, I'm extremely optimistic about our ability to dramatically reduce mass incarceration. I think it becomes complicated when we get to the question of whether we can reach to serious violence or not. But even that, because of what I know about crime survivors, I think is within reach. I do not feel the same kind of optimism about white supremacy and racism in this country. And I think that's partly because I do not think there is the same like majority level consensus, right? If we're talking about, when you think about federal policy and we're talking about running the numbers and building power, which is partly about numbers. And I don't think there is a way through that is as incremental as we would like it to be. I think it will require of us a national reckoning. I think we have gotten as far as we can get without telling the truth about what we have done and what it therefore requires. And I think absent like that level of truth telling and reckoning, I think we'll continue to sort of trim around the edges and watch the tree continue to thrive and grow, because that's what happens to trees whose roots are left intact and whose edges get trimmed. And so I think the demand to confront the white supremacy and the legacy of racism in this country requires a level of directness, a level of difficulty that is going to happen. Like the reckoning is upon us, I believe it, but that I don't see us choosing as willfully as I do see a path to choosing an end to mass incarceration.
Thanks, Danielle. And Eric, let me just help all of us understand where we are in our time together. This is the end of the roundtable, and in many ways, we're going to spend the next hour or so trying to pull together many threads of a very rich conversation into some sort of tapestry that we can take a look at and say, well, we've put something together that has some strength and some durability through these ideas. I'm going to recognize Bruce in a second, who had his hand up, and then after hearing from Bruce, we'll come back, and I have just a prompt that will help us sort of organize this last hour plus together around the theme of values and goals and obstacles and aspirations and hopes. So let me throw that in after we hear from Bruce, and then we'll try to wrap up our conversation. Bruce?
Yeah, this is a really interesting conversation, and it's pulling together a lot of different threads that we've been talking about over the years, I think. I was struck by Danielle's observation that the movement has been mostly about destruction, not creation, sort of 90-10, and we got to flip the ratio, and that strikes me as right in a lot of ways. And you think about sort of the wins that that have been registered, and the kinds of goals that people have been mobilized around, and it's things like look how drug policy has changed over the last 10 or 15 years, and that's mostly about shrinking, right? That's shorter sentences, defelonization, that sort of thing. Bail reform, mostly about shrinking. Sentencing reform in general is mostly about shrinking. And so what does this positive model look like? What does this sort of more creative alternative look like? And I heard two things from the three of you. One is that it replaces the current punitive logic with some alternative kind of logic, some means of accountability, perhaps, that does not have punishment at its center. So that's one. And then the other is that some creative alternative that's beyond shrinking is organizing, is mobilizing, is promoting of social solidarity and capacity for collective action. And we don't have so much of that. It's hard to like point to models of sort of active policy changes that are on the table, if adopted, would be empowering of communities to act collectively on their own behalf. And then the theme of reckoning was brought in again, and this started way back in Durham. That in order to get to that model of more foundational change, flipping the ratio, going from 90-10 to 10 to 90, we need a truth-telling process or a reckoning process. I feel we're missing a step. Right. I want to understand better. So say we do this reckoning process or begin a journey on a process of reckoning. How do we get from that, acknowledging history, acknowledging past harm, bringing system actors to the table to do that, providing communities with an opportunity to describe the harms that they've experienced? Say we embark on a process like that. How does that yield this new kind of policy or politics, this new kind of politics that is not just about shrinking, but is positively constructing perhaps alternative modes of accountability and is mobilizing for communities? I feel I'm missing a step, and maybe I'm just missing it and it's there, or maybe we need to spell something out. There's something else in this process in which reckoning is getting us to a type of vision of alternatives that's community empowering. I don't know if that's clear, but that's what I was sort of wrestling with listening to the conversation.
Bruce, that's a great question, and as you noted, it's been a theme for the Square One roundtables since Durham, and actually from our first executive session. And we hope to have some writing on this topic coming out fairly soon. But let me just ask folks who would like to take up Bruce's challenge to, you called it a missing step, but if reckoning is a precondition, if confronting the legacy of white supremacy and the racism in the system and acknowledging the harms caused by the system over the years, if that's a precondition to moving forward, what's the next step? Let's just assume that it is, because we've said it is important and a precondition. It may not be sequential, but it is necessary. Has anybody got some thoughts on that question before we move ahead? Huge question. Last time, you'll remember, we talked about the truth and reconciliation idea, and then it was mostly framed as a matter of accountability for harms, as a way of sort of naming the harm, talking about how we got here, who, what systems, what agencies, what institutions have been responsible for that harm. So it came under the accountability heading, but Bruce is asking a different question. Not that that's not an important one, that's also important, but how does that lead to, and what might the next step be, lead to a different sort of vision for justice and safety and well-being and healing? Bruce, it looks like It's a big question. It looked like a big question.
Happy to say something briefly about it and then stop talking
Yeah,
for the rest of the day.
no,
because
Danielle,
I'm obsessed with this question.
We love hearing from you. So
which
please.
is like TBD. I think that's the thing about reckoning is it's not a plea bargain, right? Like it's not, we get to know what the thing is, and once we know it, we acknowledge our guilt. I think I've told the story about my godson when he was like 5, and there were a bunch of kids around, and there was a party, and they broke this glass thing that I think was once a vase, and I sat them all down and was like, who did it? And they're like, and I was like, I can wait you out, like you're 5. And finally my godson raised his hand and said, what will the person who did it have to do? And I said, they'll have to pay $1 and write an apology if they can write, or say it if they can't, and make something beautiful to replace it. And then he said, I did. And then this other kid was like, and I helped, right? Because they wanted, and I think as white folks in America, we're like, what will we have to do if we admit it, right? Like we want to know in advance, because I think in the ethos of white supremacy, the only possible cost for what we are on the verge of admitting would be like centuries of torture and death, would be an eye for an eye reaching forever, right? Like to our children's children. And so we're like, I wasn't here when that happened, right? Like we're still there. And so I think that's one of the things about a reckoning, is that it is a fulcrum, like in these processes, they are a fulcrum between the past and the future. And they are necessary because the future isn't knowable without that truth telling. And if it were, we would go straight to it. But it is the missing piece, like in the alchemy of that generative process of developing things other than the things that already exist, where we just get the F out of their way and let them thrive. I mean, there's a ton of that to do right now that doesn't have to involve this level of transformation. But for that level, I do think it comes sequentially. And I think that's part of what makes it so hard for us to choose it, is that we want to be told in advance what it will cost us. And that is not possible. And I think what we know from people who have participated in restorative and transformative justice processes is that the things that are possible on the other side of telling the truth are not knowable on this side of it. And it is part of what makes them so extraordinary, and part of what makes so few people want to choose them.
Thank you, Danielle. You've given a lot of thought to this topic. We know from the title of your book, and you're welcome to make contributions on the theme of reckoning at any time. That's very, very helpful. John Simon is up next.
Well, mainly, I just really wanted to thank this panel on both for the work that they've done individually and the essays that they wrote or have written in conjunction with this. I actually think it's a perfect kind of conversation to end on, or to continue in terms of the national and the public out-facing conversation. I think it brings together the themes of anti-violence and human dignity that I've been thinking about during this values process, and it grounds it very concretely in the realities of where violence comes from. I just wanted to respond briefly to the thought about sort of mechanisms, Bruce's question. One, obviously a lot of people are talking about this, but I'm curious what others think. I meant reparations. One of the interesting things about the carceral state is it's sort of like the Germans. They've kept meticulous records about all the crimes that they've committed, essentially, against people, who's been arrested, whose wealth was forfeited. There's records of all of this. Who has spent unnecessary years in prison based on a flawed theory of incapacitation that was supposed to create public safety. All those people should be considered for some kind of compensation that would actually invest in their communities through them. So that's one sort of level. It seems to me we could reach an awful lot of people that way. The other is sort of going back to one of my old hobby horses, which is human rights. And it seems to me, if you have a country like Argentina that has, where the military runs amok for a while, you need to then create an institution that permanently marks a new deal in terms of that institution. So you have a human rights court, or you create some kind of committee for the prevention of torture that has tremendous authority to intervene in all kinds of other state agencies. And I think in the US, we've developed so few modern human rights institutions, at least on a global standard. We don't even accept them Nelson Mandela rules for prisons. And it's always struck me that in California, where we did in some ways much worse at a much worse version of mass incarceration than perhaps even New York, that we ought to close the Department of Corrections and not just add names like rehabilitation to it, and have something like a committee for the prevention of torture that basically has authority over any detention facilities that we're going to continue to have at the local level or at the state level.
Yeah.
Thinking out loud.
Yeah, terrific thoughts. And John, just to mention to others, if they didn't notice it, that in the chat during the last session when there was discussion about mass incarceration in New York State and New York City, you very helpfully, I think, added a discussion about policing in New York and in other parts of the country. So just if you would expand upon that, get that into the conversation as well, because I think that's also another point of possible intervention in terms of a reckoning, yeah, in terms of harms caused.
But I think there's an important point here that's sort of raised by Vinnie Schiraldi's, very provocative, important question, like when will we know that mass incarceration has ended? Has it ended in New York? I always, looking from California at sort of around the end of the first decade of the century, I thought the story was New York had replaced mass imprisonment with a kind of mass aggressive policing, where a good deal of the population was being essentially imprisoned in a functional way by stop and frisk, by aggressive use of Isa Kohler Hausman writes about in Misdemeanor Land, sort of the marking and having lots of people in orbit around the carceral state in various forms of not quite freedom. So I thought that was the story, which didn't look all that attractive to me. Like, are you going to trade mass incarceration for that? It's certainly not worse, but is it really better enough? But if I'm hearing correctly, something happened in the last 7 years. Stop and frisk stopped, or at least went down very dramatically. And it leaves me just with an empirical question, like, are Black bodies being less messed with, after 8 years of this than they were in the later Bloomberg years? What is the NYPD doing with all this time on their hands? If they're not arresting people or stopping and frisking them, what exactly are they doing? Is it contributing anything to public safety, or should we shrink them rapidly and use that money to do something more productive?
Right. So we've landed on this really important place, and appropriately at the end of our time together. And thank everybody for helping us to get here, which is to have our last discussion be on the importance of accounting for harm over decades, generations, as a precondition to some form of reckoning. It's a way of accounting for harm, and there are lots of ways to think about how that might be done. John just said, we know the names of the people who have been in prison, right? We could presumably do the same for people who have been arrested. We know the children who the research that Danielle cited. In essence, we know the extent, the reach of the carceral state over the last, we could say 50 years or so. So we actually can identify at an individual level, individual harms, to some more extreme than others. And I think we have some sense of communal harms and harms to our democracy and harms to labor market participation and the like. So certainly if you believe that one of the preconditions to arriving to a new vision of justice, and maybe it's, again, I never think it's sequential, I think they're actually simultaneous processes, is a form of reckoning, a process of reckoning. It would be really helpful if we could just add into the mix here, so make believe this is a chat on the screen. What do we want to account for in this truth process that might lead to reconciliation, but at least it's a truth process that recognizes harms? Anyone want to add to the list that we've constructed here already? Abby, you had something in the chat that was also a very constructive additional thought that you might want to articulate. But let's just sort of think about this for a second. What might this look like?
I hear you calling on me, Jeremy.
I did.
It's okay. No, I was just thinking back to the, a few of us went to South Dakota and in Pennington County, which is Rapid City, and then drove to the Pine Ridge Reservation. And, you know, those of us who came representing systems and academia just really, I think, stopped talking and just leaned into listening for a Native community who was so bad, right? And how we have these visits and then get back to the van and just kind of be like, whoa, how do you even like deal with that? And just we acknowledge that who gets to decide what a reckoning or accounting for harm should look like or should be. And I think that, you know, depending on, you could even get down to the neighborhood level, it's just going to be different. And that if systems want to shut up and listen and like figure out what process would be meaningful, that I think folks should really define that. And I think when we listened, I mean, Catherine was there, when we listened to folks who live there about their experiences, it was all across the board. So we couldn't even, you know, put all of the people who live on the Pine Ridge Reservation in the same kind of category, and how individualized it was. That was really the aha I had during that visit. And I just shared it in the chat because I felt like it really was a pertinent experience for myself as it pertains to this conversation today.
Thanks, Abby. Catherine?
Yeah, no, Abby, I'm glad you brought that up. And you know, thinking along those lines, I'm thinking this is a little bit responsive to the question that you've just raised, Jeremy, but also was sort of thinking about, you know, if we're trying to grapple with what does it actually mean to reckon, what is that process? What comes out of it? You know, the way that Danielle framed it, like, you know, what's the bargain we're making to go into that, or you know, whatever that might be. And you know, what strikes me is that, you know, we can think about we have the receipts, as Amanda Alexander has said before, as John was just alluding to. You know, we actually have records. There's some very concrete things we could potentially do. I think in this room, we also have consensus that would barely scratch the surface in terms of the reckoning that needs to take place in this country. And I guess I'm just trying to think like, okay, well, what if we just start on some of these things? I heard a fascinating story the other day that was talking about efforts in the decades following the end of slavery, the end of explicit slavery, to set up pensions for former slaves, and the leadership of a particular Black woman who was a former slave herself to work to try to create this idea that that individual people who had previously been enslaved would be compensated on a yearly basis. And I just was listening to that and thinking, you know, that would have been, you know, dramatically insufficient had it happened. But what would be different now if 140 years ago that had actually happened, and there had actually been, in this case, financial reparations, or at least a contribution to reparations in a financial sense for huge numbers of formerly enslaved people? I think would have been really different. So I'm trying to think, like, what, to your point, what can we add to the list of the many things that we could start to think about and put on the table? Perhaps direct financial or other types of compensation for people who, you know, who have a receipt, and their families and others, but then also these, you know, as Abby was saying, you know, also thinking about this at a community level, like, you know, let's just start on some of these things and see where we can move, and then, you know, that's gonna lead us to new answers and lead us to pieces of this that, you know, we can't all see right now, moving that forward.
In addition to that, there's this interesting first step, which is finding as big a descriptive basket as you can for describing the harms. And you know, you can talk about the people in prison, children of incarcerated parents, but merely counting is not enough, right? So that's not a very satisfying answer. And I'm reminded of the work that Heather Ann Thompson is carrying out in Michigan. May have mentioned this to some of you before, where she, as a historian, is working in that state to find as much documentation as she can about the era of mass incarceration. And you know, letters home, receipts for the trips for family members for visitation, all the ways in which the burden and the experience has been documented by those on the receiving end. It's part of an organizing effort, because people on this screen have an easier time talking about harms than the general public does. So what does that look like as a matter of sort of pricking the national conscience rather, to get to that point? Other observations about the truth-telling part of Truth and Reconciliation, and whether that's something that can be imagined. Susan Glisson, please.
I would just lift up the brilliance of Sherilyn Ifill, who wrote On the Courthouse Lawn a few years ago. She said that, we start to have these conversations and we start to, pull all of the last 400 years of history into the conversation, and it's overwhelming. It's hard to get a hold of it. And she said the best and most effective conversations about these topics are the ones that are the most local. So getting as close as possible to neighborhoods, to communities.
Yeah.
In New Orleans, we worked in cities where death rates were highest from gun violence, but what was working in Central City didn't necessarily work in Treme or work in the Marigny. You get that local, you get that close to folks. And it reminds me of, Reverend Peter Story, one of the architects of the TRC in South Africa, said, when folks talk about the failure of the TRC, he flips it. He said, the TRC didn't fail South Africa. South Africa failed the TRC because it did not continue the work of the TRC in regular local communities. I think that's where we got to go.
Excellent. Thank you for that very much. I saw another hand. It was up momentarily, but it's down. Yes, Courtney? Down? Okay. That's okay.
Yeah.
So it's up to you, of course. So let me just push us a little bit. So let's just in our mind imagine that there's some sort of reckoning underway, and that we feel that it's as fulsome as it should be, given the extent of the harm and the many ways in which this has been carried out and realized throughout our society. What I'd like you to do in our last half hour together is to really flip this around a little bit and just help us imagine a way forward. And I'm going to be very explicit about this, just to sort of as a prompt to get some discussion underway. And I'm going to ask you to answer the following question. Imagine we're sitting here 10 years from now, and something very important has changed in the world that we've described to each other over the course of this roundtable. Something is significantly better. And it may be that the pessimists or those who are not as hopeful would say, well, that's just not going to happen. But please see if you can imagine that. Something is significantly better I'm not talking about the system necessarily, that could be your answer, or it could be what's happening at a community level on these issues. It could be what's happening in a sector, but something in the world that you know, maybe not your world, but the world that you know, something is significantly better about how our society responds to harm. The second part of the question is, if you can imagine that, what would have happened? What would be the necessary precondition to getting there? I'm going to take reckoning as something that's already underway, as a given in this mind exercise. So I'm not saying that we're going to go, to the promised land, imagine that everything's better. I'm not saying let's wait for a century and hope that lots has happened. Just is there something within sight that you in your work could imagine that would be significantly better, significantly different? Maybe in the work sector that you work in, maybe not. Sector you write about, or maybe not. Or where you can see that there might be some significant changes. And if you want to put that out there, what's it going to take to get there and be as ambitious as you want to be? So this is constrained visioning exercise, constrained by time, 10 years, constrained by only your imagination, really. And don't let the second question be the constraint. I don't want to know from you only those things that are possible, but what do you think is out there that could actually change, so that we can end our time together with some sense of possible movement in the world. So take a moment, think about it. I'll ask you to raise your hand when you're ready to jump in, and we'll see where we go. I'm not going to ask everybody to answer, but I'm really interested in what you think is possible 10 years from now if we sit here together. Courtney, I note your hand was up from before. Are you also raising your hand on this question? Mm-hmm. Okay, so in that case, because you had your hand up earlier, you get to go first, and then Monica, then Eka, then Keith, and then Emily. Great. Courtney, take us 10 years out.
So I'm glad you gave us a moment, because sometimes the first thing that pops in my head isn't always the most brilliant thing. So I had a few moments to kind of tie some things together. So in terms of the 10 years, I'm thinking that significant community investment in those communities that have been most impacted by incarceration. We know the zip codes, we know what those communities are. So instead of them being gentrified, that they are actually invested in. And for me, when I think of something I can set my sights on in the work that I do, it's education. In the next 10 years, if we can school differently, if we can school children differently, at least in my state, we cut down 40% of the children who end up in our criminal justice system. And it may even be bigger than that, because that number is about referrals. School is so connected to what they're doing in the community, how they spend their time, you know, what they're focused on. And so we could truly, I think, break the link, disrupt the link between education and justice if we focus on education.
Great, fabulous, great. You have modeled, not the precise answer, but you modeled the way to think about this question. So thanks for that, Courtney. Then Monica is next, and then after Monica, Keith.
I'll be really quick. So Courtney's intervention is really quite germane to mine, because I was actually thinking about myself and my space as a legal educator and law schools, and the complicity of lawyers in like doing this, like actually carrying out the system, enabling the system. There's a way in which legal education is just so focused on punitiveness, individual accountability, all of these tropes that are part of a lot of toxicity. So on the horizon, I see, and largely because of the activism of many people, but including law students, reorientation of curriculums. You know, John Simon mentioned earlier teaching an abolition seminar, but we can go so much deeper than that, like incorporating abolition, incorporating like focuses on white supremacy and healing-centered ideas into every place in the law school curriculum. I actually see that as being possible because individual law professors control what their is, and also, like, you know, there have been some movement building within the legal academy. So I'm excited about that.
As somebody who went through that system unhappily, came out the other end okay, I will volunteer my time as a tutor in one of your classes. That is so important. Lawyers, unfortunately, control so much power, particularly in our system. So thanks, Monica. I love that idea. Keith, you're up next.
Thanks. My comments are very much in line, I think, with what Courtney shared, and that's just getting the police out of schools and replacing them really with counselors, therapists who are not connected in any way to law enforcement or probation or any of that. And I think the way we get there is by, I think we have to stop pretending we don't know what we mean when we say defund the police. We need to just tell the truth about what we're trying to say, and actually make it happen, and support the services that especially our kids really need.
Yeah, great. Again, doable, 10 years, and but has, as you said, Keith, enormous implications for the narrative of what reform really looks like. Thank you, Keith. Next is Aneka.
I'm gonna go with the twofold answer about what we're deconstructing and what we're building. So I think we're in the midst of figuring out what transformation can and should look like, because we have increased transparency into policing thanks to cell phones. And it's forcing a conversation about what a world with a different type of policing or without policing can look like. And I believe we're on the horizon of increased transparency into all other parts of the criminal justice system, which will force us, hopefully much earlier than 10 years from now, into conversation about what transformation in those parts of the system can look like as well. And then I do believe that, and this is building on what Monica, Courtney, and Keith have all said, I do believe that we are also in a very good position to build up healing communities within schools. We have a lot of healing curriculums and healing frameworks for schools. I think it's getting the political will to get school systems to pick this up so that we can build up our young people in healing communities and not just think about what we're destroying in hopes that they don't have to experience it as kids or adults.
Nick, if you would just go one level deeper on the accountability and transparency point that you made about cell phones and policing. So what's it going to take to get transparency and accountability? You know, you mentioned policing and what's visible with a cell phone, but more broadly, you know, we've talked a lot about the roles of other system actors and the agencies that you know run the system. What is 10 years from now? What does transparency and accountability for their actions look like?
We're starting to see it. So I think it was the New York Times recently released a report about uses of force in New York corrections, and talked about how, you know, staff were lying on reports. I think the more that we have an insider's view into what's happening into these systems, thanks to advocacy groups, thanks to human rights groups, thanks to journalists, then I think that those windows will open up more. And we as community members can kind of encourage the political will of these elected officials who are running these systems to say, we want to know more about what's happening within them. I think we haven't learned more because we haven't asked for more, partly. And we're starting to ask those questions now. Yeah.
And just one New Yorker's observation, that New York Times article was made possible only because the records of the disciplinary records of corrections officers had to be made public, only because the statute that otherwise barred them from being made public, known as 50A, had to be overturned by the legislature and the governor. And they did that only because of the insistence after the uprising after George Floyd of those who were leading the movement. That was a target of organizing. So it's a clear case of organizing to transparency to accountability. Now we'll see if anything changes in Rikers. So thanks for those. We have up next is Emily, and then Susan after Emily.
Great. So I too appreciate this question with a 10-year time horizon. And, you know, much of what Danielle is saying really resonates with me, which is really thinking about the part of abolition that's tied to building, you know, and we haven't just spent enough energy there, and also the TBD. And to me, it's in the TBD that really it's the processes. I've just been trying to spend more time thinking about the processes that need to be in place to get us to where we want to go that are critical. And, you know, thinking about what Renita and also Nadia shared today, and really kind of centered around the perspective of a person that was living in Brownsville, right? That what they could name was that it wasn't important to be in a community with lower crime rates or violence, but what it feels like to live in a community that thrives. And so, this might be a technocratic solution, but I've really been thinking about how it is, and this is happening in the health systems now, where we reclaim the narrative of success. What does a successful health system look like? What does a successful educational system? Even as we dismantle criminal justice system, what does success look? And I can imagine that, led by people that have been disproportionately impacted by mass incarceration, we have new measures of success that define what thriving communities look like, where people have access to food, access to medications they need, feel safe in their community. And these systems and organizations are equal, shared, and decide kind of with those that are most impacted on these measures that are across communities. And so in doing so, the systems are now forced to work together. They're forced to think about kind of their success in different terms. And the data, if transparent, then have these systems accountable to us, accountable to the people that live in these communities. And to me, that's the most transformative part, and also kind of with a high lens towards how they are disproportionately oppressing communities of color, I think, are key. We can see some of this in the health system right now. There's anchor institutions that are happening now, where the metrics of how health systems operate are actually being defined by the kind of thriving nature of communities around them. And so especially funding is tied to them, and that's what's happening within health systems. This feels like a lens that can move it forward.
Thanks, Emily. As so often happens when you join the conversation, we realize that we have so much to learn, and you'll be quick to say health system is not perfect, but we have so much to learn from you and your colleagues who work in health systems, because the crosswalk is not that big, and you embody it. But I think we have a lot that we can learn, and I have a hope that someday we can have a conversation about crime policy and never use the word recidivism. It is, to me, just like, that should never be a part of our discussion. It's so toxic. So we have up next is Susan, and then Donna.
Just quickly to Keith's really great point in the chat, and to Aneka's point about political will, if over the next 10 years, community organizing was invested in the way that it was in the last 10 years in Georgia, in all the 11 states of the former Confederacy, you would transform the South. Reverend Barber said that we're not a red here, we're under-organized. That would change everything.
Yeah. May that happen. Thanks, Susan. And we think we know what it takes. Just look at Georgia, and other states we can add to that list. Virginia is my other favorite state to talk about these days. So let's. We have up next is Donna, and then Danielle.
So I will say also that education to me is really foundational. I had mentioned in the chat earlier that we have youth-led organizing in our community, and they are organizing actually to change our educational system and the people who are currently making decisions in that system. I have a specific call to action, which people can maybe take as a more general commentary on what it might be important in the change we'd like to see here, and ultimately that impacts the criminal justice system. And that is, we need locally for our local government to be representative in terms of single member districts, as opposed to at-large positions, particularly in communities that are showing a lot of demographic change. In our community in particular, we do not have representative government because they have decided to keep entrenched a system that will, perpetuate the least amount of change for the longest period of time. And that is all at-large seats, which is totally not representative, right? And the kids are, trying to push for this. We do need legal partners in making that argument legally. So those who are in the legal system, who are trying to support the activism that is happening there, we definitely need help with that, because that's a lot of pro bono work that legal groups could be doing with us. yeah, anyway, if we had representation, then I think we'd have changes, like for instance, in hiring practices in our district, we have like a gross, disproportionately like small number of Black educators versus our Black students in our district. And that would look a lot different if we had representative government here. They would understand the importance of having concordance, racial concordance in our schools. And that would, do a lot of things for making sure we identify all of the gifted, academically gifted students, even if they are from communities of color, which is happening not so much right now. We would have, less of a school to prison pipeline, hopefully no school to prison pipeline happening anymore. But those things really are at the root of the systems that sustain, I think, the problems that we see in the criminal justice system.
Great. Thank you so much. And then next we have Danielle and then Catherine.
That was so powerful. Thank you. I'm going to go big and say, by my best estimate, on the day I was born, there were 443,850 people locked up in the US. And I would ask Bruce and Jeremy and any other data types on the call to not calculate my age to the month, as Todd Clear once did when he heard that. And so when I say, and I believe we can get to that number in 10 years, and I don't believe that's inevitable. It might not even be likely, but I do believe it's possible. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge it as possible as we think about how we shape our work over that kind of time frame. And I'll say quickly why. I think the first is that to get to that number, we don't actually have to, keep talking about reimagining justice, like we have to imagine some magical world from scratch, when in fact, we need the capacity to recall the late 70s. And while I know that capacity is not one everyone possesses, it is a capacity some people possess. And there are records, even from that ancient time, that we could turn to for guidance. And so
just watch out on that ancient time thing, Danielle.
I work with adolescents all the time. And like, I remember when computers were invented, and just to horrify them. And so I think it's important that we not let the scope of imagination that we're called to do, like put us in a mindset that we think that we have to be capable of that kind of visioning to just get to a number that most of us have seen. And I think also I said a bit earlier that I think that sheer number of people who now have direct information about mass incarceration has in it the seeds of its demise. And I think we cannot lose the opportunity that is present in that, like the sheer scale of how many people in America know. But there are two things I'll say about why I think that's possible in the timeline we're talking about, not just broadly. And one is, I think about this book I read many, many years ago called The World Without Us, that talks about what would happen to New York City if human beings just suddenly disappeared. And it's like, how long until the bridges collapsed? How long until certain plants came back, until forests came back, until bears came back, And the lesson was like, this shit requires very constant maintenance, because it's unnatural. And the system we have in place is extraordinarily unnatural in any way we understand that word. And it requires constant maintenance, like constant surveillance, constant arrest, constant sentencing, constant denial of parole, constant reinforcement through sentencing law and everything else. And so in working, when we understand it as a thing that is not just like it's the status quo and we have to change it, but rather it's a thing that requires the continual reinstatement and reimposition and reaffirmation and resourcing to do that, because all of those things are also very expensive. The possibility of cutting off the sort of gasoline to that tank, I think, becomes much more imaginable to us in a way that's really important. And it doesn't mean we don't have to make things retroactive and release people. Of course we do, but even the resistance to that requires that same maintenance. And then the last thing I'll say about why I think it's possible is I think that once in a while, there are periods in history where change happens at an accelerated pace. Like we see that. The Highlander Folk School was doing great stuff in the 40s and 50s, but wasn't nearly as busy as in the 60s, right? We see that happening. And I think we are living in one of those times. And that I think things that were unimaginable a year ago have become normalized now. And I think younger organizers know that. And I think we are called on, like morally and in every other way, to listen to them and recalibrate our expectations and our ambitions and the way we work, the associated labor, to their far more ambitious vision, because I think that they may be right.
Great. So Danielle, I am with you on the ambition. I'm with you on its feasibility. I am increasingly with you on this might be the time to really push hard so that not only do we change sentencing prospective, that's why I raised it in the New York session. What are we going to do about where's the organizing around that goal? And I think the time, in my most optimistic moments, the time might actually be right, and requires a discussion about retroactivity. And I think that might actually be possible. So in my most optimistic moments, a lot of barriers there. But Catherine, you're next.
Thanks, Jeremy. Danielle, thanks for that. And I'm going to take a page from your optimism there a little bit as well. When you posed this question, Jeremy, the thing that first popped into my mind was, you know, you see these sort of surveys that are, you know, of young people who don't believe that they're going to live past age 18 or 21, that for Black and brown young people, they don't believe that they have a future in that very literal sense. High percentages, not all, but high percentages. And I was thinking, you know, 10 years from now, if Black and brown young people universally believed that they had a future of their choosing, of their empowerment, of their lived in, and then I was getting stuck on, you know, well, the second part of the question, what is it? What would that take? And my list was really long. And listening to all of you all, what I'm struck by is that, like, everyone has named a goal and everyone has named a mechanism to get there, and you could practically interchange every single one of those with every other one and still be moving forward to the same place, which I think is really exciting and inspiring. You know, if we get back down to, you know, disco and the 70s, like Danielle and John are suggesting, you know, in terms of our rates of incarceration, that would have an enormous impact on what I just mentioned. That would have an enormous impact on, you know, the sense of thriving in communities that Emily's talking about. It would have an enormous impact on, you know, all of these different things that folks have brought up. And so I take that as a push to, you know, choose any and all of these and start moving forward in them, because that's going to be, that's the interconnectedness of thinking about bringing all of these things together in terms of what we're building, as Keith was saying, and not just only focusing on what we're tearing down.
Well, this is just a great list of achievable dreams, let's call them that, and a very clear-eyed sense of what it will take to get there. Bruce has been listening carefully and has volunteered to offer some observations about what you all just produced, and maybe some clear-eyed, realistic assessments of the hurdles. And then I'll come back after Bruce for one more prompt, and then we'll move to closing it out.
This was a challenging prompt for me. And I was chatting with Jeremy on the side. I'm saying I'm not sure I can fully do this. I'm thinking about stuff that seems very difficult. One thing I think is really possible, and it goes to Danielle's last comment, number of comments on the political process, right? We look at concrete processes of policy change in our own localities, changes in drug policy, bail reform, things like that, and think about the resistance to them, and you know the hardline DAs and the sheriffs, and just you know a reservoir of punitive sentiment in public opinion, and that's shifting, and I think so. One really positive thing I think is, I wonder if this resistance shrinks in a very nonlinear way. We get to some tipping point and the whole political environment changes, and very significant change becomes possible, and we're not there yet, but we're on this path where the political resistance to reform is gradually shrinking, and I wonder if this is like non-linear. You get to a tipping point, and then really big things become possible quickly. So that's a positive proposal. Here are two things I so deeply worry about, and then they're not related to the criminal justice system at all. But I think they're just fundamental to the context we're in. One is economic inequality, and you think about the trend in income inequality and wealth inequality, particularly in this country, over the last 40 or 50 years now, and it has just steadily increased year after year, and we now have a tiny little class of people in this country who are unimaginably wealthy and hold unimaginable amounts of power in American society. And so it's new. I mean, we used to be able to point to the Roaring '20s and the robber barons and so on, but we've even surpassed that now. And the concentration of economic power and wealth is so extreme in this country right now, and I think that presents an enormous challenge to democratic politics. And the other thing is climate change, and it seems inexorable, right? We're past the point of no return now, and the only viable alternatives for us as a global community is sequestration of carbon, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, because it's not 10 years off or 5 years. It's always in the future, and that point has changed. And the costs of climate change are going to fall massively on the most disadvantaged and disempowered people. And so I just can't fully get my head around those challenges. And in our patch, there is such incredibly positive stuff happening. But then I kind of zoom out and I think about those things.
Thanks, Bruce. With your permission, I'm going to ask our group to zoom back in a little bit, recognizing that climate change is huge, income inequality is huge, and enough to drive us to inaction. And I want to just take your first comments about tipping point. Is it possible? And just ask this group to answer another question, and then we'll turn it back over to Bruce to wrap up this entire roundtable. We've talked a lot about power. We talked a lot about power sharing. We talked a lot about the reluctance of those in positions of power to give up the power that's required to make the changes that we would like to see. At the same time, we've talked about, on the other side of that, coalition building, organizing, the ways in which the last at least several, since the George Floyd murder, but I would go back to Ferguson, that the dynamics about justice reform have changed with the movement for Black Lives. There's an insistence for reform. So that we put under the heading of reasons to be optimistic. We did that this morning. So many of you mentioned that as something that was a presence in our in our modern life. So here we have entrenched power, a movement that we see as having potential in terms of its power. So the next thing I'd like anybody to offer an observation about is to get from here, and I'm still in the 10 years thinking, to get from here to being able to wrest power from a system that is likely to want to hold on to it, and make some of the changes that we think are possible in 10 years. Any of the, not necessarily the ones you nominated before. What's the organizing precondition in order for that to happen? And I know that's a very broad question, but and it's not my my particular area of expertise or firsthand experience. But so I'd love to hear from people. What's it going to take in terms of a coalition building, organizing? Is it at the ballot box? Is it? Remember in our session in Detroit, where our first paper was on violence as a tool for political change, or resistance as a tool for political change, and that's prompted a really pretty deep discussion. So just help us think about what's the organizing activity that you think might be necessary. So be the historian that looking back on 10 years, say we got to a much better place because that happened. What do you hope for in terms of that coalition building, organizing, activism, not at individual level, not at a institutional level, but in terms of broad coalition, demanding people demanding that things be done differently? Is that a vision that you want to articulate for us as to looking back 10 years from now, you say, oh, that's what helped us get to this point. So take a moment to think about that. I'd be grateful for anybody who has a thought about that. And then we'll do that share those thoughts for 10, 15 minutes or so, and then turn it back to Bruce. And again, please use your blue hand. Thank you, Nneka, for being first up, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on this question of how is power going to, we take as a precondition that there has to be a shift in power, and how is that going to happen?
I reflect on the conversation that we had with Marlon and Daryl, and I think about how there was a conflict there in whether or not people who are organizing in community can coalesce with people who are working within the system to uproot the system. And I believe that progress is happening as it is right now, with us working in separate lanes for the most part. But I believe more progress will happen when people who are organizing in community can partner with people who are working within these systems and understand how toxic they are and want to see them dismantled, working in community to dismantle these systems and reduce these harms.
That was a wonderful contribution. Thank you, and good to be reminded of that part of their discussion, which was so rich and really personal for them. They were really eloquent on that point. Who else wants to contribute to this discussion about? And it's a version of Bruce's, I think, optimistic hope or optimistic prognosis that maybe we're at a tipping point. But what's going to tip the balance here? And frankly, I don't see a lot of tipping happening already, but I think that's necessary. Monica.
I guess I'll say one thing, which is, I think we reached the tipping point in part by pointing out the relationship between a lot of the conversation we're having here, like education, housing, like all of this like broader network of the change we're trying to build. I think leaning into the fundamental interdisciplinarity of transformation can help build enough political capital, because it's not just about people who tend to work on like the criminal system.
Did Jeremy freeze? Okay. I had a two finger. I'm gonna I'm gonna totally abuse Jeremy's internet failure too.
I'm sure there were pearls of wisdom that I missed, but sorry about that.
I hadn't started yet.
Okay.
I took me a second to realize you were frozen.
Yeah, right.
But I had a two finger on Monica's, and mine wasn't as substantive as that, but I thought that was right on. And I think sort of what could be very generative politically is the creation of virtuous cycles where policy change commands more support, commands more change. And you see that the model I think of is in social policy, right, where social security gets established in the 1930s, becomes very, very difficult to dismantle, and then expands in the Great Society to eliminate poverty among the elderly, and you know, it's an incredibly popular program, and it's politically, you can't retrench it, and we don't quite have virtuous circles of policy change commanding support, creating more change. But I think this more expansive idea that involves housing and education in tandem with changing how we think and do justice, think of and do justice. I think that's the basis for a virtuous circle in our sphere, and we don't quite have models for that yet.
So, same question for Monica and Bruce, just as follow-up. Are you saying to us that it's important for people in those other sectors who work in those sectors or work on those issues to be advocates for justice reform, or that their effective advocacy around housing, for example, will help support justice reform? If you see that difference.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say, I mean the former more so than the latter, actually. And I think that's also true for people who work on criminal legal system transformation, which is to say, like, we have to understand how intersections happen and not, and just not be sort of so limited in our scope of understanding how you're actually going to build, you know, as Danielle was talking about, like, how do we actually create stuff? I think we create a new world by not just focusing on like internal to oneself.
Yeah. And I'm reminded of the contributions from our schools principal from New York, whose name I'm sorry I've forgotten, but when she was saying, you know, I'm an educator, but I really care about what you guys do because it affects my students and my ability to function well. So any final thoughts on this organizing idea, sort of the power shifting idea before we move on?
Only to echo again what we were all mentioning before, the organizing that happened in Georgia and the very direct linkage of political power to change. I mean, that's when we're writing the history, that's going to be in there, and hopefully because it was then expanded to all of the former states of the Confederacy, as Susan said, and beyond.
Yeah. I would add to that very explicitly organizing around voting rights for people with felony records. And there's various calculations as to how that would have changed the outcomes of various elections. And that's our colleague Daryl Atkins is very much involved in that, as are others. And we see that this is difficult. Only look at Florida to see how difficult that is. But what a change that would make if that was across the board statutory reform. Susan?
Yeah, just to put a exclamation point on that. In 2016 or 2017, the Women's March, there were 8 major women's marches in Mississippi, my state. The largest marches that had happened since the 60s. Last summer, there were 32 Black Lives Matter marches across Mississippi. 32. And most of them were planned by young people. It's a tipping point.
There you go.
It's a tipping point.
Yeah, great. So unless there's a final contribution to our thinking on organizing, we will start to bring this to a close. Not seeing any hands raised, blue or otherwise. Great. So I'm going to turn it over to Bruce for some final observations about this roundtable. But let me just, if you would, as a matter of sort of personal privilege here, just to thank all of you for your contributions to not only this roundtable, but to the other executive sessions and roundtables that you participated on. It's been just a remarkable journey of a lifetime, frankly, for me, and you made it possible. And I know that I speak on behalf of others who are not here, who've been some of our participants over this 3-year journey. And my only hope is for you, and now I'll make this a 10-year hope, is that you take some of the ideas that have been generated here and just make them happen, whatever it takes, because the ideas that have been generated here are really, really powerful. And I know that there's the capacity with members of the roundtable and the larger Square One family to really change the world. And we will be running alongside you, watching you, supporting you where we can, learning from you, as we've done over the last 3 years. But thank you for making all this possible. So our final thoughts are from Bruce.
Yeah, I feel we're getting pretty talked out. I had some summary notes. I don't want to go through them all because I don't think I can do justice to the conversation that we had. I will say, as just sort of my concluding observation, the conversation we wound up having, which is characteristic of the roundtable, we draw it up on the whiteboard one way, and then the genius of the collective genius of the group takes it in a completely different way. And I thought we were going to be plumbing the depths of philosophy and thinking about the deep principles that will govern the future of a radical justice project. But we spent a lot of time talking about politics, actually. The theme of values surfaced for the group, an urgency about action, which I just learned so much from the roundtable process in this way. And in retrospect, of course, that's what a conversation about values would be. It would be, how do we act? How do we act on our values? One of the really interesting things was, for me in this whole conversation over the last week or so, were the forces that divert us from our values what keeps us from honoring our values. And an interesting thread in that conversation was professionalization and the professional pathways of career advancement and even, I suppose, personal development and so on, can distract us from the principle and sense of mission that we most esteem, which we had a very honest conversation, I think, about system actors, and Aneka spoke to this just now. I think it's a super interesting and critical question, and I think sort of figuring out how coalitions can be built, broad coalitions that remain very, very honest to our missions and can overcome all of the personal diversions of professionalization, and that happens on the movement side as we well know as well. And I think that was an important thing for me that came out of the conversation. So, professionalization can divert us from our values. What can help us honor our values? And the thing I took away from that was democracy. It is in democracy that we need to affirm the connections of social solidarity, and it's in democracy that we see our issues, our problems in the lived reality of other people, and we come together to solve those problems. And of course, democracy is under deep threat right now, and I mean we've just seen that in our political process in the last 6 months. So that's all I want to say. I wish I had something more elegant and deeper, but that was a lot for me and unexpected. I want to, so this is our last meeting, and we've been doing this for 3 years. We've been doing it in the roundtable format, and we've been doing it in the executive session. I got to thank the incredible people who work on Square One every day, and I mean they just walk the walk every single day, and it's Suki, who I think has just provided such astonishing leadership. It's Namika, who has played a parallel role with the executive session, Madison and Evie, who you've all had contact with, just utterly extraordinary people. I'm in complete awe of how Catherine stewards this whole crew, and we're on a staff call last week, and Jeremy and I were reflecting, the best decision we've ever made in the last 3 years was bringing Catherine, Suki, Anamika, Madison, Evie on board, who are extraordinary. And I want to close these thanks by just acknowledging Jeremy's role in Square One over the last 3 years. I mean, if it wasn't clear in the Justice in New York session, Jeremy has been fighting for a fairer, more equal and just and humane and compassionate New York City for decades now. It's a life's work that's truly extraordinary, and I listening to the conversation, I could see Jeremy's influence through many of the panelists at the table, and it has just been utterly brilliant. It's been a gift to be able to work with him for the last 3 years. I'm very grateful for that. Final thing, this is not the end. We're going to do more, and this is the end of this chapter, although there's still more work we want to do with this particular chapter, because there are papers that we have plans for, and so that work will continue. But the friendships and the relationships that have been built around Square One, I think, are so powerful. For us, I believe we've made some contribution to the larger national conversation. This work will continue. We'll fill you all in on that as our own plans develop. But there's definitely more work to do, and we hope that you'll continue to join us. It's been amazing. I think you're all extraordinary. It's just been a privilege to work with all of you. So thanks very much.